was at CAA Sacre, but he's now also an associate researcher at the CCA, the Iron Institute, where he's part of the polymathic team. In particular, I'm very excited to have Francois here because I think he's been very good at pushing this intersection between ML and astrophysics and doing really creative and interesting applications of math pressure. So very curious to hear about representation learning and the ideas he has for astrophysics.
Thank you, Carol. I think you can hear me okay. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, the thing I want to tell you about today is this new line of research that I just started a few months ago as part of this polymathic team. So it's a new talk, and I'm very curious to hear your feedback and see what you think. But it's essentially trying to explore this limit of training very large-scale models on extremely large amounts of data and see how we can use this new trend in machine learning for the benefits of astrophysics. So to give a little bit of quick context, which I don't need to go too deep into for this crowd, you know that we are living in this exciting new era of large-scale astronomical surveys, and in particular here, this is the Rubin Observatory, which is going to acquire a huge amount of data, observing kind of almost systematically half the sky once every few nights for a period of 10 years. So that's a huge amount of data. But beyond a lot of data, it's also a lot of very high quality data. So here is a quick illustration of how you could see one object, one galaxy in previous generation surveys, in current generation surveys, and next generation surveys. You can see that whereas the sky was really simple and everything was essentially just a blob in the past, now the sky is a lot more complicated, and making sense of all of these objects, disentangling the light and of different objects, blending them, is becoming a lot more complicated. And so doing science with these images is intrinsically more difficult because the signal is more difficult. So at the same time, you all know here that we've seen a big trend in astrophysics in the last few years of trying to deploy machine learning and deep learning methods for the analysis of these increasingly complex signals. And this is just a visualization of that trend starting around 2015 when CNNs became a thing in practice. And going up to 2023, where we have about 700 papers a year that mention deep learning, CNNs, or neural network in their abstracts. But one thing that I want to highlight with this trend is that the vast majority of work so far has been done in the regime where you would train a neural network from scratch in no matter what application you're interested in, and you would train it in a supervised learning setting. And that approach, I will say, will have some drawbacks and some limitations that will limit in practice how much we can use these tools for the analysis of surveys. So the first limitation that I want us to have in mind is that if you want to train in a supervised way a model, you will quickly run into this limit of having only a finite amount of supervised training data. And so that will happen in many situations, but one of the interesting cases, for instance, here is if I want to identify strong gravitational lenses. If I want to train a model in a supervised way to identify these objects, I need to have a large enough sample of these objects to train it with, to begin with. And so for rare and novel objects, which are the one that we'll be the most interested in the future, that is always going to be a problem, an issue. The second example that I have here is, let's say that I'm interested in doing parameter inference from some of these objects in, let's say, a simulation-based inference framework. So this is one paper that we did a few years ago where we were trying to infer parameters of these microlensing events by taking the time series, fitting it through a neural network, and then inferring a posterior on some of the parameters of this thing here. The problem here is that this network that you see here, which is the thing that makes sense of the data and relate the data to the parameter space, is in itself a network that needs to be trained and potentially on a lot of simulations. And so that is also very costly. So it's, again, some sort of supervised training problem where you will quickly run into the issue that you need a lot of data to train this correctly. And then there is this other issue that since everybody is training on their own specific data set, their own specific models for specific tasks, it very heavily limits the reusability of existing models for different applications. So I don't know if in the audience you are aware of any use cases where you've been able to grab an existing machine learning model and applying to your problem, but for me that has never been the case. And so that limits, again, how easy it is to use these methods and to share these methods with collaborators. Okay, what can we do about this? So meanwhile, in computer science, there has been a very interesting trend in the last few years, moving away from this traditional way of training neural network in a supervised fashion and going to unsupervised training. And these methods are generally known under this concept of foundation model. So foundation model is a very big buzzword. You will hear it everywhere these days. But I want to convince that there is some interesting things behind it. It's not just buzzwords. So the general idea here is that instead of trying to train a model specifically to perform a specific task, we are going to pre-train models without supervision, so like from the data itself, on extremely large-scale data sets and not for a particular task. So here is a quick illustration here. The idea is that you would gather a lot of data, you would train a model without specific supervision, and then that model will act as a foundation that you can use to transfer to some downstream tasks pretty easily. So that's the whole idea. So you would pre-train this model. And one way, for instance, if I have an image data set that I can build in a self-supervised training strategy can be very easy, just like this approach, where what they do is masked autoencoding. So they take any input image, they patch it, and they remove parts of that image, and they train this model just to predict the missing patches. So this is a strategy you can apply with pretty much any data, any problem. It's not specific to anything, but it will give a very good training signal for this encoder model that will learn a good representation of the data that you can then use and transfer to some downstream task. So the next step is once I've pre-trained my model on lots of data, I need to come up with a strategy to adapt it to a new downstream task. And the final aspect of these foundation models is because they're not specific to any particular task, you can also combine them and build more complex systems out of simpler components. And so there is a notion of reusability of these systems here in this point there. So that's the whole general idea of foundation models, but let me show you in practice what it means in classical image classification problems. So what I'm showing you here is on the y-axis, the accuracy of classification on this ImageNet problem. So this is natural imaging, classifying the type of objects that you have in those images. And if we concentrate on the left part of this plot for now, the size of these dots is how big of a model I have. And you can see in blue traditional convolutional model, and those are more modern transformer-based models. But what you can see is that as a function of time, we're getting better and better. We can build models by changing the architecture that reach higher results, a higher accuracy test, but it saturates, and we cannot go much better than that. Essentially, you can't, if you try to build a larger model, then you don't have enough labels to train that larger model classically on this data set. And then what you see here on the right is a different approach. Instead of training specifically directly these models on the data set, you pre-train them on a much larger data set, and then you try to apply them on this classification problem. And what you can see is because I have so much more data, I can train much bigger models, and those bigger models actually translate into a significant improvement in terms of classification accuracy. So that's kind of the spirit of those foundation models, is that by making use of all of this extra data, you build an extremely good representation of your data that can get translated into significant boosts compared to your previous approaches. That makes sense? Any questions? So, yes. Yeah, go for it.
When you say you pre-train these guys, and then in order to apply them for a classification problem, you just predict for the new features, and that's it, right? So you're not talking about fine-tuning it or anything.
So I haven't told you how then I use this thing that has been pre-trained. So like one way to pre-train it would be this masked autoencoding that I mentioned, very general. But then how do I apply it in a new problem? So this brings a second point that I want to emphasize here is this notion, it's a little bit vague, but I'm going to call it linearly accessible information. So the point here is that most of these models, what they do at some point in the network is that they create an embedding of your data. And that embedding, contrary to some traditional things that we've seen in machine learning so far, where you try to reduce the dimensionality of your data as much as possible, this embedding can actually be pretty high dimensional. But it has the very nice property in general that I can, with a simple linear projection, project that embedding of the data into or towards some particular properties that I'm interested in. So for instance, whether that property could be the class of that object, I can learn with just a linear projection. So here is like a plot that illustrates exactly this point, and that's called in literature what the linear probing. So I build that representation in a self-supervised way, and then I add a very simple matrix on top of that representation, and I just train that matrix to project to whatever prediction task I'm interested in. So here they show you the effectiveness of this linear probing as a function of the number of objects I need at, this is some sort of fine-tuning time, like to adapt my model for this particular prediction task. And you can see that with just a few examples per class, I can get a near perfect, 85% was kind of like the best performance that you could have before. So with only 25 examples per class, I can constrain this projection matrix, and I don't need to change anything of the underlying network, and I get near optimal performance here, or as best as good as you could do. In this example, there is no fine-tuning involved. It's just I have this representation of the data, and I can project it with a linear transform into a classification, and I reach near optimal accuracy in just 25 examples per classes. So that is extremely interesting because it means that your very general model you can use in a very flexible way and very easy way. You can go further than this, so there is a spectrum of ways that you can adapt your model. I just mentioned that for things that are closer to language models, you can show examples of the tasks that you want to solve, so that in context learning, that's the way that you can ask ChatGPT, here's an example of how to solve this task, now do it for another task, and it could understand it. Linear probing is, so here there is nothing to change. The model is able to adapt to a new task. This is very challenging, but that exists. Linear probing is I just add this linear projection on top of the representation. And there is also this concept of fine-tuning where now I actually adapt the weights of my big model to be good at doing the specific tasks that I'm interested in. So this is more expensive, and you probably require some training data, maybe more than in this case, but this is super cheap, and it already works pretty well.
I just want to make sure I understand linear probing. So you learn this embedding.
That's right.
That kind of is a nice expression of the information you want to know, and then you have some input image of a panda, and you set it in there, and it's somewhere in that 512 dimensional space, and you only need 1 or 5 or 10 pandas before you're like, that's the region of the space. But you're learning some matrix, which is then 512 by number of classes, or by...
That's right, exactly.
Okay, but you haven't constrained it. So do you need 5 or 10 of every class, or do you just mean
Per
you
class.
can learn panda and not panda, and that's all you care about?
You could do that. You could do that. You're completely free to design this projection matrix. And the main interesting point is that a single layer, linear layer, is enough. And that has to do with the way that transformers actually manage to interpret data. If you could do this a little bit better potentially by having an MLP, not just a linear projection layer, and you may be able to squeeze a little bit more information. But this already shows you that the information is very well structured in that representation space, in linearly structured.
Yeah. No, I like that it's linear because you can find what you want in milliseconds then.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's the big picture. So, okay, so if we take this new way of doing machine learning at scale, that is currently the way that everybody does it in computer science, what would it mean for us? So the first thing that I think is very interesting is that for us it means that we never would have to train our own neural networks in the future. And I don't know if you've ever tried to do this for a science application, but in most cases that I've seen, it usually takes a PhD student maybe like a year to get just a network to work well, to be trained, and before we can start to ask questions. And that's normal because there is a lot of know-how and like tweaks to do. It's not easy. But here, potentially, you could grab an existing pre-trained model and then just work from its embedding, and it would be almost as good as you could ever get. Okay? The second thing is that that gives us a way to do very efficient or very performant deep learning, even in regimes where we have only a few number of training examples. And so in the future, one of the things that I'm specifically interested in is finding objects, very rare objects in LSST or Euclid with this strategy, because we can create these projection metrics from just a few examples, And so we can then query very large databases of objects with just a few training examples. And that, I think, is going to be super powerful. The last point is that if all the information is pretty much contained in this linearly accessible embedding, you could imagine that in the future, in the catalogs that your survey will provide, you will have, classically the photometry measured by the pipeline, but you could also have the linear feature embedding computed by one of these big models as one of the features providing in the catalog. And that feature would contain almost as much information as the original pixel data itself. And we know that we can access that information pretty easily with very simple tools. So instead of manipulating very large machine learning models, in the future, I can query from my database these embeddings of the data. And with very simple linear operations, I can actually build very, very powerful classifiers or very powerful inference methods. So that's what I see for the future of these methods. And so now I'm going to show you a concrete example that we developed with this group, Polymathic, in New York. We have this archive paper already out there, but we are working on a new version, and I'm going to show you some of the results from the new version today. And the thing that we're doing here is a method to build that representation. So far, I've told you about mass auto-encoding, but there are other ways that you can build those representations from data itself. And in this particular case, the way that we do this is by trying to find a representation that can align different types of observations of the same objects together in that representation space. And it's a method that we call AstroClip. So before telling you about this method, I want to tell you about what this CLIP thing is. And CLIP stands for Contrastive Language Image Pre-training. And it's a method that was used originally to find a way to embed in a shared space data that can have different modalities, and in particular, images and text. And so the way that CLIP works is that you have pairs of examples of, let's say, text and associated image. I can get a batch of those examples, and I can try to look at, let's say, the correlation in that embedding space between the embedding of an image and the embedding of a text. And what I'm trying to do is to maximize the correlation of those diagonal elements. So when I have the embedding of two objects that actually are consistent, it should be aligned together. And when it's inconsistent, so if instead of a dog here I have a cat, I would want those embeddings to actually misalign strongly. And that is captured by this loss function that you see here. That's what it tries to do. So if I'm very good at doing this, then I can build an embedding of my data. And once the embedding is trained, you can use it off the shelf for doing a lot of very interesting things. So for instance, in this paper, they advocated what they called zero-shot prediction. And the way that it's done is that although this is not a classifier originally, now if I take the embedding, the trained embedding of this image, and I try to see how well it aligns with the embedding of text of this form, so a picture of something, and I can have different things, the thing that it will align the most with is actually going to be the right answer here. So you have a notion of proximity in that space, embedding space that you can use for building what they call here zero-shot prediction. So an embedding that you can use directly off the shelf. And this method is actually still used today. It was developed a few years ago now, but this is one of the key components behind what are called these days visual language models, where some of them work like this. This is one strategy, a flamingo strategy. It was state-of-the-art last year. It's not state-of-the-art anymore. But essentially what it did is that once those embedding vectors are trained with this CLIP strategy, what they do is that they can feed images, they can compress those images, and then they take the embedding and they fit it inside the language model. And what they do is they just trained these pink layers that just tell the language model how to interpret those images. But the big vision model here is frozen and it's not changing anymore. So that's an example of compositionality, where you're using an off-the-shelf model that has been trained before, and you're plugging it into a bigger model to give vision to a language model. And so that worked pretty well and still pretty close to state of the art. And another thing that these type of things have enabled is associating language to text for tasks like image generation. So you probably are all familiar nowadays with like Midjourney or similar services that can generate images, condition, and text. And the way that you create that connection is through this clip embedding. So here, for instance, you can condition the generation of an image on the embedding from this text. And if the embeddings are very correlated with the images, then you'll get a pretty accurate image based on the conditioning vector here. So that's just to show you how it's used in the wild. But then back to our problem. So the way that we try to adapt this method is instead of thinking about text and images, we are thinking about two different ways of observing the same system. So in this case, we are taking observations of galaxies from the decal survey and the spectra, the corresponding spectra that come from the DAISY early data release catalog. And what we do is apply exactly this info-NC loss function that tries to align the representation of those two modalities together in that latent space. And essentially, when we have pairs of the same objects, we try to promote their proximity. And when they are different objects, we try to push them away from each other. So you're trying to bring together objects that are the same, but observed in different ways to have the same position in that latent space. And then once that is trained, you can do a lot of things with just this embedding. So this is an example, for instance, of similarity search, where I take the embedding of one of these images, and I look for all the nearest neighbors in that embedding space in terms of images, and I find those ones. And so you can already see that the proximity that you build in that space is going to be related to the physics of the objects that you're looking at. Another type of thing that we can do that is very similar to this zero-shot prediction classifier that I showed you for images is now, let's say that I want to infer the redshift of this object. One way that I could do this is by embedding my object in that latent space, having a bunch of spectra that come from some training sample, and I can see which spectrum is going to align the closest to this particular object. And then for the spectra, I can analyze them, I can know their redshift, and I can make a prediction for what is the most likely redshift for this object based on which spectrum is actually coming the closest to the embedding of this object in this space. And so I could return just the closest number here, or I could do a weighted average of the nearest neighbors. And that is a way that you can build what they call zero shot, just out of the shelf, a redshift estimator for these things, or any other physical properties that you would have access to from the spectra. Does that make sense? Any questions? Yes. No, so that's a very good point. Here, there's nothing that goes back to the data space. It always goes from the data space to that embedding space, and you don't go back. And that's a big difference compared to the traditional methods that were based on autoencoders, where the loss function was really expressed in the data space. So we're trying to find an embedding that could turn back into the data. Here, you're getting rid of that entirely. You're just asking for the embedding here to be informative about that image. And I'll tell you a little bit more why afterwards.
So you're just finding the nearest neighbor.
Here you're finding the nearest neighbor in that embedding space.
So it would be slow, but you could do a gradient descent to an image that is as close as possible to the spectrum or something.
Yes, but it could go in crazy directions.
It could go crazy.
Yeah, you could. That's right. Actually, it would be a fun thing to try. Yeah. All right, so now that I give you the general idea, I want to tell you the concrete machinery that goes behind this, because this is a little bit novel. This is not something that we're too used to in this field. We essentially use a transformer architecture for all components of the system. For the image part, we use a VIT large method, and essentially, without going into all the details, the way that it works is that you take your input image, you split it in patches, then those patches you project with just a linear matrix, and that will create an embedding for each of the patch that you can then feed to a transformer model. Feel free to ask me more questions afterwards if you're interested about how this works, but this is very different from the traditional convolutional neural networks that we've seen in the past. And those models outperform convolutional neural networks without assuming any of the symmetries that CNNs assume on images. One of the main particularities also here is that they're able to to scale to much larger data sets compared to traditional CNN. So that's one of their advantages. And then for spectra, we use a similar strategy. We actually take the spectrum, we patch it, and then we fit it to a transformer in the same way. So that's the neural architecture that goes behind it. And then training those big transformer models is pretty tricky. It's not something that you can do just out of the box and assuming that it will work. So the way that we do this in practice is by pre-training separately both the image encoder and the spectrum encoder. And then once they are pre-trained separately, we align their representation with our loss function that tries to align the representation. So I just want to tell you about how we pre-train just the image part. And this we do without the supervision of the spectrum. But we use this method called DynoV2, which is a self-supervised contrastive learning method, the details of which are extremely complicated. And I'll just illustrate this by this list of all the, essentially the components that go into this method. Each one is complicated on its own. It's more black magic than science. And there's no explanation about why it works, but it works really well. And essentially what it does is by just taking examples of images and augmenting them with either cropping or noising or rotations or blurring, it finds a way to train a VIT model to create an embedding that will be very similar no matter what is the augmentation that has been applied to your image. So this is a strategy for self-supervised learning. But once this is trained, people have demonstrated that you can use the VIT that comes out of this method for that is able, let's say, to be very easily adapted to additional downstream tasks. So for instance, this is taking a model that is trained with this strategy on images and then taking the embedding of each patch and just adding a linear layer to predict, let's say, a segmentation map out of this. People have also demonstrated that with, again, just a linear projection matrix, I can take the embedding created for each patch of the image and predict, let's say, the depths of this image. So it shows you that this method, completely self-supervised, is able to extract a lot of very high, high-level information about your image. All right, so that's pre-training of the vision transformer. We do a similar thing for the spectrum transformer, but this is much simpler. We just train it with masked autoencoding. So essentially, we take the spectrum, as I said, we will patch it, and then we ask to be able to reconstruct the missing patches from the rest of what we fed the model. So here are a few examples of, let's say, this is in a masked region, the prediction of the model during pre-training compared to the flux at that location in the masked region. This doesn't need to be perfect. It's just a pre-training task that helps the transformer pick up on the important parts of the signal. And then when this is done, we take this already pre-trained and well-initialized model, and we finished the alignment by trying to make the embeddings to align correctly between the images and the spectra using this contrastive learning loss that I showed you before. So this is a little bit technical, but once this is optimized and works, you can do the following thing. So here I'm just showing you more examples of cross-model similarity searches. So in those examples, it's once I've trained the model, I embed either spectra or images into this space, and I try to look for the closest matches in that embedding space using this metric here, which this cosine similarity matrix, which essentially is a normalized dot product between the embeddings that you get from the two objects. So here, for instance, you have on the left the query objects that we use. These are the closest example that we get when we compare the embedding of images and images. This is the images that correspond to getting the closest example between spectra and spectra. And this is, for instance, if I take a spectrum as the embedding of a spectrum as my query, and I'm looking for the closest images in that space, I get these images like this. So I can do searches in all those configurations. And I can take a quick look also at what would happen for spectra. So for instance, here, I'm looking for the spectra that are the closest to my query spectrum. And you can see in gray the spectra that the model has put the closest to the query spectrum in this case, where the query spectrum is either this red one or this blue one here. So just to show you this ability to query things by similarity. More examples. So this is, again, taking this galaxy as my query example. I'm looking for closest images, closest spectra, but I'm showing you the images that correspond to the spectra. And again, I can do this cross-model by asking what are the closest looking images that correspond to this particular spectrum. So that's cool, and I'll show you an application, like a concrete application for this thing just after. But I also want to show you that I can use these embeddings to estimate or infer interesting properties of these objects, despite these embeddings having been not supervised at all during training. So here, the particular example that we chose is just a very simple redshift estimation problem. And we use as a baseline just trying to infer the redshift of these objects from their photometry alone, or from a specifically trained ResNet model. So what you can see here is that there is more information in the images. So this is a ResNet model that is applied on the images and trained supervised to predict redshift. You can see that there is less scattered compared to just using the photometry. And now we want to see if we take the embedding out of our model from either images or spectra, spectra is not even interesting, it will work too well, but from images alone, to see if we can recover the same amount of information from the embeddings. So here is an example of trying to do this redshift estimation using a k-nearest neighbor regression method. So we take the image, we embed into that space, and we look for, in this case, I think the 10 nearest neighbor spectrum in the space, and we make a prediction for the redshift based on these nearest neighbor examples. So I show you 3 different examples here. The first one is the previous state-of-the-art self-supervised learning method that existed from Stein et al. 2020 paper. And what you can see is that in that embedded space, I don't actually have such a nice structure, and the nearest neighbor examples are not necessarily the one that are at the closest redshift. If I take directly the embeddings that comes out of my dyno pre-training of my vision transformer, you can see that it's a little bit better. It actually finds more structure, but it's not yet super well aligned with this concept of redshift. And if I now take my aligned embeddings, so the outcome of this entire training procedure, I can find that my prediction is now similar or even better than the dedicated model that I've used specifically to train on redshift. And here, I'm not training anything. I'm just looking for the nearest neighbor in my embedding space.
So you say you use
10 nearest neighbors.
Do you weight them by proximity?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So this is a very simple method. We can do the same thing with just having a simple MLP prediction head on top of the embedding. And you find that it pretty much does not affect the results here. So the nearest neighbors are already sufficient in our embedding space to find all the information. So that's for redshift, but we try to apply the same strategy for a bunch of other properties. And so we used this probability.js catalog generated by Changgun Han, which is just trying to infer a bunch of galaxy properties from the SEDs of these objects, from the DAISY catalogs. And what you can see here, for instance, is to see the precision of our prediction for, let's say, the stellar mass or the age of the object, or the specific star formation rate, for these embeddings with 0 shot, so just looking for the nearest example in that embedding space, compared to just, let's say, a specifically designed ResNet network that would have been trained specifically to try to regress those properties. So you can see that for some properties it's pretty similar, but for some others it's actually better than just a dedicated model. And so that is just an example that this model has been trained without no concepts of, let's say, stellar mass, is able to pick up on this information. And then just by doing either just looking for nearest neighbor or a simple projection of that space, I can have access to those physical quantities pretty easily. And finally, the last type of example that we did is, so predicting physical properties is one thing, but one of the main aspects or things that people are using convolutional neural networks for is to identify morphology. So we took kind of the state-of-the-art of morphology classifier that's out there, this model called Zubot, and we try to see how well we could do with our model that was never trained specifically for morphology, compared to the Zubot baseline. And so this is the comparison in blue of the classification accuracy by this reference. And in red, this is the classification accuracy that we get by projecting our embedding space for this classification task. So it's not necessarily exactly the same in all tasks, but it's not random, and it's actually pretty good. You could even fine-tune it further if that's the task that you would be interested in. So that's essentially the main idea of this method. But I wanted to end on how is this different from the traditional way that people have built representation from data in astrophysics. So far, most of the methods that have existed have been based on different strategies for autoencoders. And so one good one, for instance, is this paper by Peter Melchior's group, where they try to, they take spectra, they embed it into a latent space. It's a low-dimensional latent space, and then they decode it back into the data space. So that's what we were saying before. Here, the loss function is actually expressed in the data space, not in the latent space, presumably. And then you can see in those examples that this latent space that is very low-dimensional has some information about physical properties. So you can see here visually. But I would make several points and several comments. The first one is that the way that you extract this informative embedding in that case is by actually forcing the network to have some sort of bottleneck, so concentrate on some parts of the information. But this is not a real, this is a bit blurry because this happens pretty much by accident, and you don't have a lot of knobs to control this specifically. There is also no constraints that this latent space that you discover should be well behaved. And in principle, it could find ways to encode the important part of your information in very complex fashion that is not easily reversible. And so you would need to work a lot to do that reverse of this operation. So these are the main differences. And more philosophically, here, this method that I showed you is not a generative modeling approach. It does not try to reconstruct the signal. Instead, it tries to extract from the signal the important features such that you can then disentangle or differentiate between objects that are the same and objects that are physically different on the sky. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that this is not the first time that contrastive learning has been used in astrophysics. There are a bunch of papers by now, but the first one of the first one is this paper by George Stein from a few years ago. And I just want to demonstrate what I think is one of the most interesting use cases here is this ability to be able to retrieve examples or objects based on examples that you would have seen. So here the method works pretty much similar to our CLIP method, but it's just based on images alone. But from these images, you create this embedding, and then you can look for the embedding of other images. And the one that would be the most similar to the one that you query are usually the ones that actually align with similar physical properties. So in a paper from this summer with Sarah Brough and her student Alice, we applied this method in practice to the detection of tidal features on galaxies. Same method, essentially. We take different images, we create augmentations of those images, we embed them in some latent space. The details don't matter too much. At the end of the day, we get an embedding from these images here, and we can query objects in that embedding space. So here is a visual UMAP representation of the embedding space that you generate this way, and it's just reinforcing the fact that objects that have similar properties would end up in similar regions in that embedding space. And then the way that you can use it in practice is, let's say that I'm interested in finding objects that exhibit some tidal features like this one. I can just show it one example, and I can query all the closest one. And so they may not all be exactly what I look for, but you will find a lot of examples that are very similar to the things that you're looking for in the most highly ranked object very easily and very efficiently. And so these kind of methods for looking for a specific object based on example will be scalable to the size of large-scale surveys. And I'm going to stop here because I have more things, but I'm going to run out of time, so feel free to ask me afterwards. But I'm just going to stop us here and follow us online if you want to see more of those work. We have a GitHub, we have a website, and we'll be posting a blog post on the rest of our work there in the near future. Thank you, everyone.
Plenty of time for questions. Yeah.
Yeah, quick talk. Very, very many questions because it's not in this area. So it sounds like that the key part is to find the best embedding space to
That's
describe
right.
the data. And could you please, I don't know whether the term is correct, could you please describe a little bit about topology of the embedding space, and is there any efficient topology or something to describe the embedding space to make this kind of more accurate?
That is a great question. The short answer is I have no idea. I'm not aware of a paper that would have looked at the topology of that embedding space. That probably exists, but I don't know.
How do you see this scaling up in modes? So, like, you have two modes right now,
yeah.
right? And it works really well, but the embedding space can be really complicated to start throwing more modes in, right? So
That's right. So to answer that question, I'm going to go back to our roadmap within our group in New York, where essentially we want to be able to scale to more types of observations, so whether it's images, spectra, time series, or whatever, more types of instruments. And we would like to have models that can ingest data from any of these modalities and build a consistent embedding space that scales. So how do you do this? If you think about it a little bit, there's a spectrum of methods you could try. On one hand, you would create a different model for every type of observation, even potentially every type of instrument, and then you would try to find a way to embed those representations jointly. So this is something that has been done in the past. So this is the spectra alignment method that Peter did. This is a paper that I did a few years back for morphologies of galaxies. But the way that it would work is that every time you build your own encoder for data. And so that would work, but it doesn't scale well because for the reason you mentioned. The future, or the ultimate goal that I can think of, is being able to go directly from the byte level data of whatever observation you have into a transformer and making sense of that data. So this sounds a little bit like science fiction, but there are already papers that demonstrate that you can take the raw zeros and ones that are in your files and do image classification directly from that. You can train a transformer to classify images. In the future, this all depends on how efficient the attention mechanism in your transformer is, because you have to deal with very large sequences. But we're going in that direction where you will have methods that can deal with that size of data, which means that in the future, you could take your FITS file from any observation, and you can train your model to understand the FITS files directly. So you would have like complete uniformity in all your data at the byte level. And this astroclip is somewhere in between. This is still using different models for different types of observation, but it's not just different models that behave completely independently from each other. The next point that we'll have on this curve is building transformer-based models that can ingest any of these types of data with some strategy. But you still need to develop some sort of encoder specific for each modality. What we're trying to do is for, let's say, if I'm interested in encoding astronomical images, I want to build some sort of CNN or a model that would be able to apply on images that come from any instrument, but it would be a different model than the one that would work on spectra, for instance. So we are trying to aggregate different modalities as much as we can, and the ultimate future is going to be this, where you can work directly at the level of the bytes.
do you worry about scaling up the number of free parameters such that, you know, computationally it becomes unfeasible? I mean, like ChatGPT or GPT, OpenAI is like, they said that they use, the rumor is 30,000 GPUs nodes to train GPT, right?
Yep.
So we don't have 30,000 GPU nodes in astronomy. So
maybe he does.
Maybe
maybe you do, yeah. But
so this is exactly the limit that we are interested in exploring.
Yeah.
So we are in this group. We're in pretty privileged situation. We have a lot of compute. We have successful compute grants in some supercomputing centers, and we're trying to see how far we can push these ideas. We'll see. There is no.
I mean,
this is
can
not
you get away
something.
with some symmetries? I mean, because a lot of these encoders are, for instance,
So-
very similar, right?
So that is an interesting question. So the trend these days is to try to avoid putting your own knowledge and understanding of symmetries and get rid of all of that and just let the transformer do the work. And so the idea is that if you try to constrain with known symmetries, you actually create more complex optimization landscapes or less flexible models. Whereas if you have enough data and a flexible architecture, the flexible architecture is going to be able to discover the symmetries. It's not that I like this approach. I would much rather understand exactly what's going on, like understand the CNN, what it does on the images. But in practice, that's the current trend.
Can you talk more about, or be more specific about how you're doing the downstream tasks from the embedded space?
Sure.
So you do zero-shot learning, but at some point you have to tell it something about redshift.
That's right.
And then also a second question along that is, I notice all those plots especially seem to underestimate the redshift a little bit, or at least...
Sure. So let me go back to the actual slide. Right. So here I was showing you, let's say, regression plots, because those are the easiest one to look at, let's say. But the real thing that I'm interested in is not really that. It's more something, a number like this, that tells you about the actual information content of that embedding for the particular feature that I'm interested in. So here, this is a negative log likelihood, which tells you essentially how concentrated would be the posterior prediction on that particular property that I'm interested in, given that input feature. And so it's negative, so I guess the lower the better, otherwise we wouldn't have put it in bold. But it shows you that there is more information in that embedding than with other types of dimensions. So then to your question, if we see a bias in one way or another, that has to do with, it's a calibration problem, but that is not a problem of the embedding. The embedding is what it is, and then you can calibrate the response of that embedding to whatever property you're interested in. So it's just like simulation-based inference. It's exactly the same idea.
So we've talked about galaxy deblending before, since objects tend to end up on top of each other. So I guess a few variants of that question might be, if you input in your training data or your test data objects with a lot of clutter around them or other galaxies on top of the galaxy, like, does it just learn to ignore that, or do you take care not to input such things?
So,
and then the other side of the question is, can you use this somehow for galaxy deblending and take those things apart explicitly?
So that's a good question. So in this case, the short answer is no. We don't do any careful thing here. We would need to think about the next generation of method to go back to the image domain. So here, as we said, we always go to the latent space, and in the latent space, that information can be like mixed, and there's not an easy way to disentangle. But the next generation of methods will also want to retain, let's say, some notion of locality in the image, and to build a deep understanding of what a galaxy is. I can't tell you much more than this, but this is essentially similar to what happens naturally, let's say, with this sort of examples, where you never actually trained the model to understand what a horse is, but then with a very simple projection matrix, I can project the embedding of each patch here into a segmentation map. So it becomes pretty easy with this large-scale model. They already understand the data, if you want, so it would be pretty easy to create with a few examples that you may have created yourself that you consider as good labels, to create this sort of segmentation maps in a much more accurate way than current blenders.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
So for instance, the shredding that happens with large galaxies, and you could identify these objects much more efficiently with this.
Yeah, I'm sure this is a huge issue for LSST. So
that's right.
Getting that problem solved once and for all, like this might be the key to it.
That would be great. I don't think we're there yet, but that would be one strategy. Yeah.
I haven't really talked about any sort of estimates of uncertainty. Have you thought about any ways of getting this technique to produce the uncertainty estimates on its outputs?
So yes. So for me, the angle that I would take here is going back to how one would do simulation-based inference. In simulation-based inference, you first generate a feature that you believe retain enough information about the physics you're interested in, and then. So that feature can be very biased or whatever, but it needs to be informative. Then you calibrate a conditional density estimator that learns to predict the distribution of properties given that feature. And that conditional density estimator is the thing that you calibrate very carefully to understand how to respond to the embedding. And so that's where you would add your uncertainty estimate. is on a few examples that constitute your training set or your calibration set, you can measure how that embedding responds to the physical property you're interested in, and you would calibrate that. But this is a second piece. This is not the piece that extracts the information into that feature.
Have you played any fun arithmetic games of like obtaining the embeddings of two spectra of a map? How does the image look like?
No. So this is something that people do. Yeah, people claim that these embeddings, you can actually sum and subtract. So for instance, if I take the embedding of someone and I subtract the embedding of glasses, then it will be close to faces of people without glasses and stuff like that. This happens more or less by accident. It's not clear that it should work. And so, no, I've not done that because I'm not convinced that it should work. It would probably do something not stupid, but I don't know how to understand it. So that.
But can you like subtract like an agent? If there's like an object in the middle and you subtract the spectra of that object?
You could, but I don't know what to expect, so I haven't tried it.
We still have time.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to go back to Dan's question regarding the prediction of, properties like redshift. So if I understand correctly, you go to the image, you embed it, and you look for the embeddings, the nearest embeddings of spectra.
That's right.
And if you're going to predict the redshift from those embeddings, you still need to go back to the spectra that those embeddings corresponded to, and
yes.
you have measurements of the redshift on those.
Right. Yeah.
If you're gonna do that for star formation rate, I guess it would be the same.
Same problem.
So doesn't that mean that you're actually doing this with some sort of labeling? Do you need all those labels
yes.
In advance before you?
So that's a very good question. So this is blind to any physical model or physical interpretation, like in the way that we train it originally. So what we discover is that it structures the latent space in some structure that actually aligns pretty well with physical considerations, such as the redshift or the stellar mass, because if we just look at objects that are similar in that latent space, they end up having similar properties. So that is some emergent behavior of this system to align objects with similar physical properties together. But beyond that, we do not know how to understand that space. There is not a dimension that is strictly the dimension of stellar mass, for instance. It actually can behave in very complicated ways, and the dimensionality of this space is really hard. So there is some direction that is probably stellar mass direction, but not one particular one. So inspecting that latent space, I don't think you would be able to identify quickly exactly what it means. And so that's why you then need to come with your own physical model and create the connection between your physical understanding, in some cases where you have one, with the embedding space that you've created. And so in this particular example, this is the way you do it. You go from those spectra, those SCDs, you fit them with some model, and that creates the connection between the data space, and the embedding space comes from the spectrum and this embedder, and then the connection with your physical model comes with your interpretation of that space. So that's how you can create an estimate for stellar mass from here in a way that you couldn't necessarily do from let's say the morphology of the subject. You create the interpretation of that space in places where you can create the link between observations and model.
Along that point, so right now you're just doing zero-shot prediction by looking at the nearest neighbor. But couldn't you also interpolate to? So
you can do whatever. Yeah.
Space, you interpolate from latent space to the data space. Is that possible? So suppose your prediction, your point, your nearest neighbor. There's a point in latent space that is further away from the nearest neighbor. There is some interpolation you can do between these points that can give you a metric from here, from latent space to data space.
Why do you bring the data space in?
Just because, so right now you're predicting redshift by looking at the nearest neighbor.
Sure.
So
yeah.
specifically, so if there is an object in your data or in your space that exists that's close enough to that object, then it's fine. But the prediction on that latent parameter might be a little bit further away from the nearest neighbor, right?
So that's an interesting point. So I don't know for people that are familiar with how we estimate and calibrate redshift in Wig lensing experiments or in cosmology these days. The way you do it is never by building a point estimate of the redshift for one object, but by doing those self-organizing maps and finding regions of similar color space, similarity in color space, and then trying to get as many training points as possible, so as many spectra, in regions where you expect the objects to be similar in color, and the meaning is that they should be also similar in physics. So there is this notion of similarity in that space, which is usually a very simple space, which is just a color space that you use to build those self-organizing maps. But here you have another strategy to create a notion of similarity and neighborhood that actually can take into account the entire image in itself. So what you're describing, maybe having an empty region in that space would be similar to saying that I'm in a region where I do not have a lot of calibration sample, or where I know what the redshift should be in that region. I could discard that region completely. Or I could try to find, to ask for more spectra in this region. And you could build the equivalent of the calibration strategies that are built for a self-organizing map with this sort of embeddings here, by trying to calibrate in neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, it must be locally linear, kind of. Like, in some local region, there's probably a redshift gradient.
Probably.
And so if you could then judiciously select things perpendicular to that gradient for your k nearest neighbors, rather than just a ball around the thing, you might do better, actually.
That's a good point,
I
yeah.
don't know.
Because right now you're limited if you have a sparse data set, right? If you're,
Yeah.
which is often true in astronomy, right? You have sparse training sets.
Sure, yeah, but so, I mean, what we do, oops, sorry. Okay.
Does that mean it's
That's
time?
it. Yeah, that's it. It's time for lunch. We would rather drop galaxies entirely if we don't know how to calibrate their redshift correctly. Right? So if you discover that there are regions in that space that are really empty, you could just exclude those. Would be a perfectly correct way to do this, like for cosmology at least.
Well, if you want to get the right answer as often as possible, but if you want to discover the new surprising thing, then you don't.
That's a different question. That's a different question, yes.
Okay, we'll have to stop here to set up for the luncheon, but let's thank Francois again.
No, that's very nice. That's really a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of a nice intermediate point. We generate images spectral light from that. So I want to try something with the embedding.
Definitely.
Thanks.
Going back to the bits in the FITS file seems like too much. That just doesn't seem necessary, right?
It is unnecessary, but it's fun to think about.
Oh yeah.
You know, this